Welcome. Thank you for coming and joining us here at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation, founded in 1962, is the leading national organization addressing the public health crisis of pornography and exposing the links between all forms of sexual exploitation. NACOSE embraces a mission to defend human dignity and oppose sexual exploitation. To this end, NACOSE operates on the cutting edge of policy activism, combating corporate and government policies, fostering sexual exploitation, advances public education and empowerment, and fosters united action through leading the International Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation. Our speaker today is Haley Halverson. Haley is our Policy Director for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, as well as the Director of Communications. In her role, Haley acts as a spokesperson for NACOSE and oversees strategic messaging development, press outreach, email marketing, social media marketing, formulates policy, and implements campaigns against sexual exploitation. She is also the host of the Sexploitation podcast and is currently pursuing a Master's of Arts at Johns Hopkins University. Please welcome Haley Halverson.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming, and thank you to those who are listening online. We're regularly having 2,000 to 8,000 people watching these presentations online, so I wish that we were all in a room together, but welcome to all of you, whether you're watching now or later. I'm excited to be here to talk with you about prostitution, what some call the world's oldest profession, but what I would advocate is actually the world's oldest oppression. And so, while it might be a little bit of a difficult conversation, I hope we can all learn together. As Madison so aptly stated, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we work to address the links between all forms of sexual exploitation, and that's really applicable to our discussion of prostitution, because prostitution exists at an intersection between sex trafficking, pornography, violence against women, sexual assault, and more. So it's good to keep the full spectrum of exploitation in mind as we discuss this one aspect. When talking about prostitution, we could delve into so much. There's a lot to talk about, but we're going to limit our conversation to the sexual violence that's found in prostitution and the reason why this should not be considered a simple job. If anyone has been participating in pop culture within the last several decades, we all know that prostitution is absolutely normalized, glamorized, and legitimized in movies like Pretty Women, HBO series like Cat House, or even regular TV like in the new Girlfriend Experience movie. And these shows all portray prostitution as something that is empowering to women, something that is liberating, sexually liberating to women, and that is very financially beneficial to women. It's also interesting, just looking at this, to notice that it's a lot of white women, a lot of white young women, most of them upper middle class, is the picture that mainstream media is giving us. But is this the reality? Is prostitution actually just another job? When we think about work or employment in America, it's important to remember that in America, work is always regulated. Over the past several decades since the founding of our nation, we've been working to create more safe working regulations, such as to make sure that children are not working an inappropriate amount of hours, that people have fair wages, that they get sick days, that people have safe working environments, that they are not sexually harassed or exploited while on the job. And as we begin to address prostitution, we see that prostitution is antithetical to any of these common protections that we find in mainstream work. One way to show this is by a advocacy project put forward by Whisper, which is Women Hurt in Systems of Prostitution, which is a fictional help wanted ad for people who would want to go into prostitution. And this serves to really show how this kind of help wanted ad would not be found in common society. A fictional help wanted ad for someone in prostitution might read, no experience required, no qualifications needed, no minimum age requirement, and on-the-job training provided. Women and girls applying to this position will provide the following services. I won't read all of these out loud, but they include being penetrated in every way by either people or by objects, being bound and gagged, being burned, being photographed or filmed while performing these acts. The Help Wanted ad continues that the workplace can be anywhere from a Ritz-Carlton to a hotel to a back alleyway to a car, even to a public toilet. Wages are negotiated at every transaction, and payments are delivered only when the client determines that services have been rendered. And also, corporate management fees, also known as pimping or sex trafficking management fees, range from 40 to 60% of wages, and of course, they do reserve the right to maintain all of the wages that might have been earned while on the job. Something else that helps us think about prostitution and work is a safety manual that was actually put out by a pro-sex work group to help women who are engaging in prostitution. And the safety manual included advice like make sure to wear shoes that could be appropriate for running or that you could kick off. Avoid necklaces or scarves or anything that might be used to choke you. Don't carry a weapon because it could actually be taken away from you. Make sure to circle the car several times before getting into a car in case there are multiple people in there. And hey, if that all fails, make a lot of noise, scream, attack, and run. And this is the advice that they're giving to women in prostitution. And I think that any mainstream company that would have this kind of employee manual or Help Wanted ad would immediately receive national backlash for the kind of violence and sexual harassment that they are promoting within their own industry. It would be a scandal of massive proportions, but these are the job descriptions and the only safety options that women in prostitution are faced with on a daily basis. Experiences that most workers are protected from comprise the core duties or conditions of employment in prostitution. It's also important to recognize that prostitution is really built on two bedrocks: one, poverty, and two, past sexual abuse. Poverty is the fertilized soil in which prostitution flourishes. I think it's important to recognize, especially in America, that the way we often perceive prostitution is the way that the media portrays it, which is from a place of extreme privilege, where it's typically white, upper middle class, educated women. Maybe they're engaging in prostitution while they're going to an Ivy League school. But I like to think of prostitution, the women who are in it, as a pyramid, where obviously at the top of the pyramid, it is a very small number of women who are engaging in it from a standpoint of not having an economic need or having other viable options for jobs. But actually, if you move down the pyramid, you'll see that the masses of those who are engaged in prostitution, both in America and in third world countries or other countries around the world, are actually engaging in it as a means of survival because it's the only way that they can put bread on the table. Even for those who are engaging in prostitution without being in extreme poverty, even for those who are engaging in it in other ways, cash is always coercion when it comes to sex, because if a person doesn't want to have sex with you unless you pay them, then they don't want to have sex with you. So the cash is being used as a coercive means to override that person's natural desire to engage in sex. And then, so as poverty is the bedrock of prostitution, so is past experiences of child sexual abuse. Research has shown that 72% of those in prostitution report past childhood physical abuse, and 82% of them report childhood sexual abuse by an average of 4 perpetrators. This is important because, first of all, what industry banks on recruiting the masses of its employees from those who've experienced sexual trauma in the past? That's not normal. But also, it's important because those who've experienced child sexual abuse then would not, when going into prostitution, already have warped sexual boundaries and an increased ability to actually, they've warped sexual boundaries and they have an increased ability to disassociate from their experiences. So that's why this link between child sexual abuse and prostitution is so important to understand as well. The real experiences of those who are in prostitution are experiences of extreme violence. Across countries, 73% of those in prostitution reported physical assault, 62% reported having been raped since entering into prostitution, and 67% met criteria for diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. What's interesting, too, about this fact is that the levels of post-traumatic stress disorder that these women were reporting was in the same range as combat veterans. So if you think about combat veterans, the kind of trauma that they're exposed to in war being equivalent to what women are experiencing in prostitution. In another study focusing on a survey of Canadian women in prostitution, they found that 90% of them had been physically assaulted. 82% of those assaults were perpetuated by sex buyers themselves. 67 of them had been threatened with a weapon, 78% were raped. Of those raped, 67% were raped more than 5 times. No wonder these women are coming away with post-traumatic stress disorder. And 67% of them had pornography made of them while in prostitution. So there we see another link between prostitution and pornography. And also, as an aside, pornography is itself a form of prostitution, which is important to always recognize. It's just another medium where now thousands or millions of people can become vicarious participants in the prostitution of one person. One survivor said that what rape is to others is normal to us. Another said, one woman described her experiences of sex and prostitution very succinctly when she referred to it as paid rape. Another described it as like signing a contract to be raped. Another described it as being raped for a living. We see survivors of prostitution regularly making this connection between rape and prostitution. This is largely because what the experience is very similar. It's an impersonal sexual encounter where one person is being used without any concern for them for the pleasure of the other. So we do see that the experiences of sexual violence, of rape, is something that's inherent to prostitution. That's something that can't be taken away with any kind of regulation or safer conditions. It's the inherent nature of prostitution for it to be a similar experience to rape. On average, 95% of those who are in prostitution want to leave and say that they would get out of prostitution if only they knew viable alternatives. What other industry has this rate of people wanting to leave it, desperate to leave it? A lot of the times I'll hear people say, well, maybe it's the person's choice, they want to be involved in prostitution, but I think it's time that we stop putting the burden on the choices of women who are entering sexually violent fields after experiences or pasts of poverty or child sexual abuse, and start focusing on the choices of those who are perpetuating this entire industry, which are the choices of the sex buyers themselves. What does it mean in our society when men can freely access and buy women? What does that say about gender equality? What does that say about sexual harassment in the workplace? That while you might not be able to harass a woman at work, you know that you can buy a woman down the street. How does that impact women in politics or women in the news? How can you respect a person that you know you could buy if the price was right? The kinds of things that prostitution does is it changes the way that men perceive women. Men perceive women as disposable objects. One sex buyer said that being with a prostitute is like having a cup of coffee, and when you're done, you throw it out. This is one of the most sanitized quotes from a sex buyer that I could find for you. Unfortunately, most of them are filled with expletives and extreme anger towards women and disregard for women's humanity. So we do know there are these things called John's boards, which are actually filled with reviews of men who are buying sex, and they go online and talk about it with other men. And there they have far more degrading terms for women than mere cups of coffee. And when you view women as disposable objects, then it's easier to perpetuate violence against them, to dispose of them. One survivor of prostitution said, you just give them what they want and pray that they don't kill you. And this woman is acting not only correctly based on her own private experiences, but also correctly based on the research that we're finding from around the world. Sex buyers are more likely than men who do not buy sex to report sexual aggression, self-report that they are sexually aggressive, and that they have a likelihood to rape a woman. Men who bought sex scored higher on measures of impersonal sex and hostile masculinity, less empathy for prostituted women. You don't have a lot of empathy for that cup of coffee that you're throwing out at the end of your morning, and viewing them as intrinsically different from other women. Prostitution creates this new subclass of women that can become the receptacle for any form of violence against women or sexual violence that might be perpetuated. And we see that that women in prostitution aren't an inherently different form of women. The only thing that separates women that are in this room or watching online from those who are experiencing prostitution at this very moment is circumstance. Rachel Moran is a survivor of sexual exploitation in the prostitution industry. She wrote an amazing book called Paid For, which I would absolutely recommend that anyone who wants to learn more about these issues to read that. It's a fantastic personal story, but also reflection on this as a societal problem. And she wrote that the acceptance of prostitution makes all women potential prostitutes in the public view, since there are only two requirements for women to work in a brothel. One is that circumstance has placed her there, and who knows when that could happen to any of us. And two, the other is that she is a woman. It is important to note that men and boys are exploited in prostitution as well, and it's important to speak out for them. But it also can't be denied that the vast majority of people who are exploited in prostitution are women. And that actually is another way that we see that prostitution is not a job like any other. Because if it was a job like any other, why wouldn't more men be actively interested in taking part in it? And it's an extremely gendered form of exploitation. The demographics of sex buyers is very wide because, unfortunately, anyone with enough money and a desire can do it. Ages could range often from 20 to 71. Typically, the average age of initiation into buying prostituted persons is around age 21. They're often college educated. 62% of them have a girlfriend or a regular sex partner. 53% of interviewed sex buyers purchased sex from women in prostitution as frequently as once a month to even several times a week. And they are also more likely to watch pornography than non-sex buyers. Why is this? Well, we see that pornography is not only linked to increasing the demand for prostitution because it normalizes the ability to buy sexual access to another woman, or the idea that women are these commodities that you can access at any time that you want. And so we again see that connection between pornography and prostitution. There's also connections between prostitution and sex trafficking. There was a cross-sectional study analysis of 150 studies, and it found that countries where prostitution was legalized, sex trafficking increased. This is important to notice because the same men who are buying prostituted persons are the same men who are buying sex trafficked victims. There is no research to suggest that some men are only searching for sex trafficking victims while some men are only searching for prostituted persons. Probably the only case where that would be true would be when a man is intentionally going out to buy an underage girl. Anyone under 18 by federal law is a victim of sex trafficking. So the idea of a teen prostitute is completely false. There's no such thing. But aside from intentionally seeking out an underage person, there's no real way for most of these sex buyers to tell the difference between someone who is prostituting of their own free will and someone who is literally enslaved. So what can we do? One study that surveyed sex buyers asked them, what would it take for us to deter you from going out and buying women? And they told us. They said, take the photograph or the name of the person and put it in the local paper. Give them increased jail time. Put their photo or name on a billboard or on the internet. Send a letter to their family saying that they were arrested for soliciting women in prostitution. Have their driver's license suspended. Have greater criminal penalties in general. Impound their car, etc., etc. So let's just do that. They've told us that this is what it takes for us to deter them. And I am absolutely in favor of taking a more demand-centered approach and focusing on ways that we can criminalize the buyers in order to dismantle the entire industry of prostitution, which we see is not a job, but is a form of sexual exploitation. There are a lot of ways that you can get involved, whether you're involved in law enforcement or policy. You can advocate for policies that focus more on addressing the demand side, or just as an individual, you can learn a lot more. I believe that these prostitution booklets are handed out for all of you today. For those watching online, I'll make sure to put a link into the bottom of our Facebook Live video. This is a great resource for just documenting the data about the violence of prostitution. Also at endsexualexploitation.org/prostitution, you can learn more and get involved with our Bright Light on the Red Light project. You can also get involved with our Dirty Dozen list. Our Dirty Dozen list is an annual campaign that we do to target 12 mainstream facilitators of sexual exploitation. Some of these facilitators of sexual exploitation include Amnesty International, which is in favor of fully decriminalizing prostitution, and Backpage.com, which is, as hopefully many of you know, facilitating the sale of prostituted and sex-trafficked people on its website. So you can actually go online at dirtydozenlist.com and you can take actions like emailing CEOs, signing petitions, sharing graphics online, and that's a great way that you can make a difference even just with a few clicks of the button at your own computer. So I think that it's time for us to be abolitionists about prostitution, to recognize that this is a form of sexual exploitation, that we cannot work with it or work within it, but that we need to abolish it and better promote human dignity. And that is all.